had a few requests lately regarding the 1 degree spot meter and how I actually use it. This video is aimed at people who are just starting out using a spot meter. My spot meter, which is this one that you can see on screen, does many things. It just doesn't do spot readings, it does instant light readings, flash readings. You can put readings into the memory. It does many things, but rather than confuse the beginner, so to speak, we'll just talk about the basic principle of spot metering. On the left hand side we can see a zone scale. There are 10 zones in that scale, running from the bottom, zone 0, which is pure black, to the top, which is zone 10, which is pure white, and in between are 8 zones. The middle zone is zone 5, and then each segment as we go up or go down is equal to 1 stop of light. When we set the handheld meter to spot metering, when you look through the viewfinder of the spot meter, you'll see a tiny circle, and wherever you point that circle, whether it be at a black card or a white piece of card, it will always turn it to middle grey, which would be zone 5, which is this zone here. Now, because it does that, it gives us control, and we know where we can then, from that reading, place zones to any area within the scene. Now, under normal circumstances, using negative film, colour or black and white, although I'm primarily talking about black and white negatives, because we know that that spot reading is always going to give us middle grey, zone 5, when we point it, say we're doing black and white photography, at an area in the scene where we just want to retain detail and texture in the shadows, you would point this spot at an area where you want that to show in the picture, take a meter reading, and then to move that zone 5 down to zone 3, which, remember, 1 zone equals 1 stop, so to go down from zone 5 to zone 3 we would have to underexpose by 2 stops. So as an example, say our exposure in this picture is 1 second at a given aperture. We know that the meter is going to turn that shadow area into zone 5. So for us to move that zone down 2 stops to place it on zone 3, we would then have to expose at 1/4 of a second. In other words, we're underexposing that area to bring it down to zone 3. It can be confusing sometimes because you have to remember that when we look at a scene through our eyes, we see a positive image. All the tones and the colours fall where they should do. On the negative, when an area is light, when it's turned to a positive, it becomes dark. And when it's dark on the negative, such as up here in the sky area, it becomes light, because we're turning the negative into a positive. And this is where I think people can get confused with it, saying, why would you underexpose a picture to take it from a shadow area, to take it from zone 5 to zone 3? It's because we're dealing with a negative. We need to make that area within that picture, in those shadows areas, we need to get those darker, and the way to do that is to underexpose the negative. Now, if we were going to, say, shoot a waterfall, and keeping in mind that we know that the spot meter, wherever you point it, will always place that area on zone 5, middle grey, and taking the waterfall as an example, if we want to keep that water white, we'd point the spot meter at the brightest area on the waterfall where we want to retain some detail, and that's usually round about zone 8, zone 8.5. So we point the meter at that area, and we know that the meter is calibrated to give us zone 5, so to get the density in the negative, to make it darker, so that when we print it, that area becomes lighter, we'd have to overexpose the negative by 3.5 stops. So we would push it up the scale, because we're dealing with a highlight area and not a shadow area. So when we're working with, as I say, negative film, like me, I shoot a lot of black and white film, I'm thinking in negative terms rather than a positive. So I know that if I want an area to go darker, I have to underexpose it. If I want to make it lighter, I have to overexpose it. There are settings on these meters that makes this a simple process. You can set ISO on the meter to the ISO of the film that you're using, the ISO that you've chosen, and then on the ISO button 2 you can put a minus number in, so you can put -2. So when you take the reading in that shadow area without doing any calculation, you just press the ISO 2 button and that will give you the exposure to place the shadows on zone 3. Zone 3 is an area where there is just detail showing and texture. Zone 2 is an area where you will see very, very little detail, but you'll definitely not see any texture. When we talk about texture, we're talking about shapes within the scene to just peek through the shadows. And when we're talking about highlight texture, we're talking about detail within those highlights that you can just see, like clouds. You want those clouds not to go to pure white, because they're not just pure white. You need to see some detail, and that's usually around about zone 8, zone 8.5. So using the actual spot meter itself is quite simple. The hard part is knowing where to meter, and that's totally up to the user. It's where you want the shadows to fall. In this picture I could have taken a light reading from a darker area, but that area didn't interest me. The area that I meter from was the most important area for me in this picture, and anything below the value where I put that on zone 3 will just go back to zone 2, or it could go to pure black. Images in black and white, especially black and white, they do need areas where you've just got black, and they do need areas where you've got pure white. And the pure white areas are usually very bright areas, specular highlights. They're going to fall on zone 9, 9.5, and there's nothing really you can do with that. Although if you're using sheet film, you can develop to the scene's dynamic range, because that's another thing these meters will do. You can measure the darkest area you want to retain detail and the brightest area, and measure that range. If it falls below the 5-stop range that you're looking for, then you have to alter the development time. And again, if it goes beyond the 5-stop range, again you still have to develop that negative to bring it within that range, so it actually prints correctly. If you're scanning negatives, it's not as critical, because I use a scanning workflow. I don't tend to measure the dynamic range. I use developers that will control the highlights, and I know that when I scan the film I can bring that highlight detail back. So that's basically it. All you've got to remember is that when you point the meter, the spot, at anything, it will turn it to zone 5, and from that zone 5 reading, which you know it's going to be zone 5, you can then work out where you want shadows and the highlights to fall. So I hope you found that helpful. It's just a short video on how to use the 1 degree spot meter.